Part of the reason, perhaps, is leadership. Just as the Qing was blessed in its first century and a half by dynamic, brave, and crafty monarchs, it was troubled in its final years by a vain and short-sighted woman who was emperor in all but name from 1861 to 1908. For the Empress Dowager Cixi, like all Manchu monarchs, her legitimacy rested in part by demonstrating that she was a proper steward for Chinese tradition. But her legitimacy was more questionable, for she had essentially usurped her position. And perhaps that is why she proved even more conservative and less politically imaginative than her Manchu predecessors. Cixi might have imagined herself as an endearing figure to her people, a guanyin, but she is more commonly remembered in Chinese historiography as a sinister figure who ruled as regent over a series of boy emperors, all of whom seemed to die suspicious deaths. This was a woman who, against all the rules and conventions, essentially controlled the Qing from 1861 until her death in 1908. When the Shenfeng emperor died, as one historian writes, quote, from frequenting the pleasure quarters so much that he became physically depleted, his son by Cixi was named emperor at only 6 years old. And while it was against formal custom for a mother empress to administer state affairs, that is what the Empress Dowager did. After seizing power in a coup d'etat, she induced the legal regents to hang themselves rather than be beheaded. She continued to rule even after the young emperor had reached maturity and was supposed to rule on his own. Like his father, he too was apparently fond of pleasures and appears to have died of syphilis at the age of 19. But his empress was pregnant with his heir. Rather than wait for that birth, however, and thus empower another empress, the Empress Dowager decreed in 1875 that another boy, her 4-year-old nephew, would become emperor, which meant that she would continue her de facto rule. Eventually, the new emperor grew to maturity and wished to rule on his own, at which point the Empress Dowager officially retired to her summer palace outside of Beijing. But the first time he attempted seriously to govern on his own and to attempt serious policy reform, in 1898, he was declared very, very ill and placed under supervised medical care, basically under medicated house arrest. Some said that it was no accident that when the Empress Dowager finally died 10 years later, in 1908, that the death of the young emperor was announced as having taken place in an unhappy coincidence just the day before. She then managed posthumously to dictate one last succession, anointing another toddler as the new emperor, the 3-year-old Puyi, and you know him, of course, from the film The Last Emperor. The boy king's reign would last only 3 short years, then the 268-year-old Qing dynasty and the 2,000-year-old Chinese Empire would come to an end. Not a few historians have blamed the Empress Dowager personally, citing her usurpations of power or at least deviations from previous practice as one of the main reasons why China became comparatively decrepit by the end of the 19th century. But we must recognize that the Empress Dowager was also a brilliant political maneuverer, if perhaps not a great statesperson. She kept the empire intact, and her overriding aim was to save the Qing and herself, though not necessarily in that order. The old Buddha, as she was called, maintained control by divide and rule on the one hand, by keeping the central government weighted toward the side of traditionalists who saw dealings with the West as suspicious and sometimes unacceptable, while on the other hand quietly encouraging industrial and military modernization in the provinces, something that would give China, in time, strength, but would, in the short term, prove to be a large miscalculation.